Summary and Analysis Chapter 20 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The Duke and King ask Huck and Jim if Jim is a runaway slave. Huck says that Jim's not and tells a lie, that he is an orphan traveling with a family slave. The pair, Huck goes on to say, has to travel at night, because so many people stop their raft to ask if Jim is a runaway. The Duke proposes to invent a way that the four of them can travel in the daytime. Afterward, the Duke and King overhaul the wigwam on the raft and decide to sleep in Huck and Jim's beds. It begins to storm. Huck and Jim are posted as lookouts while the Duke and King sleep. The next morning, the Duke and King scheme as to how to make some easy money. They decide to put on a production of Shakespeare and begin to practice for a performance at the next town they reach. Having reached a little town down the bend, however, they're surprised to find that no one is around. A sick black person in town tells them that all the townspeople have gathered for a religious revival camp meeting back in the woods. The Duke goes to a printing office in town. With Jim still on the raft and the Duke at the printing office, Huck and the King go to the meeting in the woods and find thousands of people there. A preacher and his congregants are singing a hymn, and the preacher soon begins to preach. The crowd goes wild. The King joins the preacher on the platform and proclaims to the congregants that he is a reformed pirate who, if given enough money, will return to the Indian Ocean to convert other pirates to Christianity, at last bursting into tears. A hat is passed through the congregation, and the King makes $87. Meanwhile, the Duke is in town at the printing office, selling bills and advertisements in, and subscriptions to, a town newspaper, making, in total, $9.50. He also printed a wanted poster describing Jim, so that he and the King and Huck and Jim can travel by day, for if anyone were to stop them concerning Jim, they could say that they have captured him and are returning him to his owners. All agree that the Duke is pretty smart. That night, as Huck comes up to replace Jim as the lookout, Jim asks Huck if he expects them to run into any more kings on their journeys. Huck says he doesn't, much to Jim's relief. Jim says that 2 kings are bad enough, drunk as they currently are. He also tells Huck that he asked the King to speak French earlier, and that the King told him that he had been out of his country for so long that he had forgotten his native language.
Analysis. The Duke and King immediately reveal themselves to be selfish and exploitative, taking Huck and Jim's beds and sleeping while Huck and Jim work. Huck doesn't trust them, and he lies about his relationship with Jim, presumably to protect him from whatever the Duke and King might have in store for him. But Huck's commitment to non-conflict prevents him from disobeying the Duke and King. Like Huck, the Duke and King are fantastic performers, which requires of them a kind of freedom, the freedom to transform into different characters. The two are also adaptable, though they don't find an audience to play to, they quickly and productively change their plans. While these are good traits, however, they can be misused, as the Duke and King misuse them to selfish ends. The King turns society on its head. By pretending to represent its values, he really serves what he values, which is solely his own, usually material interest. Even though the King's story is wildly improbable, the worshippers give him their money, maybe because they are so zealous in their faith that they fail to see the truth before them, which Huck sees all the time, that people are not trustworthy. The Duke's plan that enables him and his companions to travel by day subverts labels of freedom and enslavement as they are established by society. It is by pretending that Jim is captured that his freedom can be preserved. To generalize this, the Duke and King present a way of life in which playing along with society enables one to be free. As good and understanding as Jim is, he recognizes that the Duke and King are deeply selfish and, like Pap, debauched. That being said, Jim invests such a pure trust in people, despite knowing how bad they can be, that he accepts the con men as what they claim to be, even though the King himself can't back up his claim to be French.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 21 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The Duke and King continue to practice Shakespeare. After a few days, the group arrives at a small town, where the Duke posts a bill advertising his and the King's performance. Huck notices that the town is dilapidated, the houses aren't painted, weeds grow in the gardens, and hogs loaf around everywhere. In town, Huck overhears a conversation in which one man tries to bum tobacco off of another. By noon, many townspeople are drinking. Huck witnesses 3 fights. One townsperson cries out that old Boggs is riding into town, drunk, much to everyone's excitement. Boggs has a reputation for insulting people. He even asks Huck if he's prepared to die. Though Huck is scared, a townsperson assures Huck that Boggs is good-natured and harmless. Boggs begins to shout for a man called Colonel Sherburne, whom he says he will kill. People laugh and talk, that is, until Sherburne steps out of a shop and tells Boggs he is tired of his antics, but will endure it, if only till 1 o'clock. Boggs continues to carry on about Sherburne. Townspeople try to shut him up, telling him he only has 15 minutes till 1 o'clock, but to no avail. A man runs to fetch Boggs' daughter. About 5 or 10 minutes later, Huck, having walked down the street, sees Boggs, no longer on his horse, nervous-looking. Sherburne calls out Boggs' name, and, just as Boggs' daughter arrives on the scene, Sherburne shoots Boggs to death. The townspeople resolve to lynch Sherburne.
Analysis. In contrast to the Grangerford estate, which is well kept and beautiful, the town Huck explores in this passage seems neglected and impoverished, and its citizens are immediately portrayed as lazy and aimless. Boggs is a kind of harmless pap, debauched but non-violent. While he seems scary to Huck, one has no real need to fear him. He is not what he seems. In contrast to Boggs is Sherburne, who is maybe the most sincere character in the novel. He says what he means and does what he says. In this sense, Sherburne, in his sincerity, stands apart from the hypocritical society of which he is part. True to his word, Sherburne tolerates Boggs's antic till 1 o'clock, after which he murders the innocent man. He makes laws, however unjust, and enforces them with brutal surety. Society, in turn, resolves to enforce their law against murder by lynching Sherburne, but as we will see, society is not so firm as the fiercely constant Colonel.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 22 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The lynch mob tromps through town, scaring women and children as they go, till they arrive at Sherburne's home, where they tear down his fence. Sherburne calmly steps out onto the roof above his porch with a gun in hand, and is silent for a long time. Then he slowly and scornfully addresses the mob. He says he is safe from them as long as it is daytime, and they are not behind him, because they are cowards, and he is a man. He tells them they are not really courageous, but borrow courage from their mass. Sherburne goes back into his house and the mob, humiliated, disperses. Huck goes to the circus, which he thinks splendid. A drunk man approaches the ringmaster of the circus, and says he wants to ride a horse, impeding the progress of the circus such that the men in the audience swarm to throw the drunk man out. But the ringmaster lets him ride. The audience laughs save Huck, who trembles to see the drunk man endangered. But soon the drunk man stands on top of his horse and does tricks. He himself is a member of the circus. Huck is deeply impressed. That night, the Duke and King put on the performance of Shakespeare in town, but only 12 people show up, and they laugh the whole time. The Duke says that the people of Arkansas aren't cultured enough to appreciate Shakespeare, and he devises a way to give them the low comedy they want. He posts another bill in town, advertising the King's Cameleopard, or the Royal Nonsuch. The biggest line of the bill announces that ladies and children will not be admitted to see the show.
Analysis. Sherburne calls the mob out on their hypocrisy, giving a psychological explanation for their false sense of empowerment as a group and a critique of their deficiencies as individuals. This is the most persuasive analysis of society in the novel. But its source, Sherburne himself, has just murdered a man in cold blood. Sherburne is free, but a danger to society in his freedom, a dark vision of what Huck could become if he follows a path of violence. If Sherburne reveals the mob's cowardice, the circus reveals its audience's cruelty. Everyone save Huck laughs at the drunk man's endangerment, when Huck's empathetic trembling is maybe the more humane response to such a spectacle. But, we learn, the man is part of the circus all along. The boundary between the real and artificial is disturbingly porous in Huck's world. The Duke and King's performance of Shakespeare invites comparison with the circus. What makes the latter fun but the former ridiculous? The circus misrepresents itself just as the Duke and King do, and the Duke and King don't endanger anyone as the circus does. It seems that the novel concludes that the royal nunsuch is harmless enough as a money-making scheme, and that the Duke and King's unique vice is in their ruthlessness when it comes to exploiting innocent people.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 23 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. All day the Duke and King prepare for their performance of the royal nunsuch, rigging up a stage with a curtain and lighting. Many men are in attendance that night, and, after the Duke talks the show up, the King enters on all fours, naked, and painted as splendid as a rainbow. The audience laughs wildly, so much so that the King performs his capering act 3 times. After that, the Duke thanks the audience members and asks them to spread the word about the show. The audience members, however, are dissatisfied with how short the show was. They begin to storm the stage before a big man jumps up on a bench and shouts that they have been cheated, yes, but that they don't want to be the laughingstocks of the town. He proposes that they talk the show up to the other men in town, which they all proceed to do. The next day, the Duke and King play to a full house and scam them in the same way as they did the audience before. As they eat later that night, the Duke and King tell Jim and Huck to float the boat 2 miles below town and to hide it. On the third and final night of performing the royal nunsuch, the house is crammed again, but Huck notices that the men in the audience all have rotten eggs and produce and dead cats hidden in their pockets and coats. Just before the show is scheduled to start, the Duke tells Huck to make a run for the raft. He does so, and the Duke does the same. Back at the raft, Huck and the Duke meet up with Jim and the King, who didn't even go to town for the performance. The Duke revels in how well he and the King pulled off the scam, and mocks the townsmen for thinking that they would get the last laugh by throwing their eggs and cabbages and cats at the con men. All in all, the Duke and King make a little less than $500. Huck knows that the Duke and King are really just con men, but he doesn't think it would do any good to tell Jim that, and anyway, Huck thinks, you couldn't tell them from the real kind. The next morning, Huck wakes to find Jim mourning, thinking about his wife and children. Huck realizes, even though it doesn't seem natural to him, that Jim must care just as much about his family as white people do for their own. Jim recounts to Huck how one time he asked his daughter to shut the door, and she didn't do it, but just smiled at him. Jim slapped her, only to learn soon after that the girl is deaf and dumb. Jim doesn't think he'll ever forgive himself for harming her.
Analysis. Thus far, the Duke and King have seemed, while vaguely seedy and selfish, harmless enough and farcically silly, a perception strengthened by the King's ridiculous performance, which the audience finds hilarious. The Duke and King seem to know what society wants, low farce, and they deliver. The men in the audience resent having been defrauded, but instead of limiting the damage the Duke and King can do to their community, they maximize it to protect their own externally derived sense of dignity. They know that what the Duke and King are doing is wrong, but hypocritically become complicit in it. The Duke and King must expect that the men in the town will use the third show as a way to exact revenge against the con men themselves, otherwise, they would not know to make an escape plan for the night of their final performance. The townspeople, then, are woefully predictable in their selfishness, which the Duke and King rather cunningly exploit. We can't help but think that society had it coming, so to speak. The Duke's mockery of society is reminiscent of Colonel Sherburne's critique, though Sherburne centers on the cowardice of society, whereas the Duke centers on people's overestimation of themselves and their cleverness. Huck might agree with these critiques, but he would not exploit society out of selfishness as Sherburne and the con men do. Huck implies here that anybody who exploits society for purposes of self-interest, from a con man to a monarch, is villainous. Social standing doesn't reflect one's character. For example, Jim, who is oppressively marginalized, reveals here that he is maybe the most morally sensitive character in the novel, supremely loving of his daughter and ashamed for having hurt her out of ignorance. In what is central to his growth, Huck learns that blacks are just as capable of love as whites.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 24 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. As the Duke and King devise another con, Jim tells the Duke that it is uncomfortable to be tied up every day. In response, the Duke invents a new way for Jim to stay by himself during a day without risking capture. He dresses Jim up in a costume for King Lear, a character in Shakespeare's play King Lear, and paints Jim blue. The Duke then makes a sign saying that Jim is a sick Arab. When people approach him, Jim is to jump out and carry on, and howl till they leave him be. The king, dressed in black clothes that make him look swell and starchy, rafts to a nearby town with Huck. As they drift in, the two run across a young country boy. The king says he'll give the boy a lift and invites him on the raft, which the boy accepts. On the raft, the boy tells the king that he resembles Mr. Wilkes. The king lies and says that he is a reverend, and that he is sorry if Mr. Wilkes is late for something. The boy then reveals that Mr. Wilkes's brother Peter Wilkes has died, and that, as he died, he wished to see his brothers from England, the living ones being Harvey and the deaf-mute William. The king asks more questions about the Wilkes family, and the boy obliges in answering. After dropping the boy off, the king tells Huck to fetch the Duke. Huck knows what the king is up to, conning the Wilkes family, but he retrieves the Duke anyway. The king tells the Duke everything the boy told him, all the while imitating an English accent. After hailing a yawl, the Duke, King, Huck and Jim all travel to the town where the Wilkes family lives. There the Duke and King claim to be Peter Wilkes's brothers Harvey and William. The townspeople sympathize and help them, while Huck thinks they're con enough to make a person ashamed of the human race.
Analysis. It is maybe surprising that a man as selfish as the Duke would go out of his way to help Jim feel more comfortable, but he nevertheless does so, demonstrating a kind of moral freedom uncommon in the novel. The Duke tends to others' interests as long as doing so isn't inconsistent with pursuing his own interests. The king dresses in respectable black to trick people into thinking, based on his appearance, that he is himself respectable. He exploits society's overvaluation of appearance. By tricking the boy into trusting him with his clothes and false identity as a priest, the king exploits the boy for information to be used in a con. In contrast to the boy's gullibility is Huck's gentle skepticism of everyone he meets. Huck doesn't care about appearances but about substance. Though Huck earlier denounces the Duke and King as rapscallions, he is now mature enough to know that none of their cons compare in depravity to their defrauding of the Wilkes family, where, in a time of tragedy, the two are not only emotionally exploiting grieving people, but are also stealing the possessions of two men whose brother has just died, nothing less than everything that remains of Peter's life.